Close your eyes for just a moment. I want you to imagine something. Imagine waking up every single morning and the very first thing you feel, before you even fully open your eyes, is the cold, heavy bite of iron around your leg. Before you feel the warmth of sunlight, before you hear the birds, before anything else registers in your body, you feel the chain. You've felt it so many times that your skin has grown around it, your bones have learned to carry its weight, your mind has stopped expecting anything different. Now imagine that this has been your life for 50 years. Not a month, not a decade, 50 years. That is longer than most people's entire careers, longer than most marriages, longer than the lifetime of many animals on this earth. And yet, for one elephant, one gentle, breathing, feeling creature, this was simply called Tuesday. This is his story. The year was somewhere in the early 1960s when a baby elephant was taken from the wild forests of India. He was just a calf, small enough to be terrified, young enough to still need his mother, old enough to remember the moment she disappeared from his sight forever. We don't know exactly what that day looked like. We don't know who took him or exactly how it happened. But we know what happens to most calves stolen from the wild during that era. They are separated through fear, through noise, through chaos. The herd is driven away, screaming, and the baby, confused, exhausted, heartbroken, is captured, dragged into a world that will never make sense to him. From the forests of freedom into the hands of men with chains. He would not see the wild again. For the next 5 decades, this elephant, who would one day be named Raju, passed through the hands of multiple owners across India. He was, in the cruelest sense of the word, property, bought and sold, traded and transferred. His enormous body, his quiet intelligence, his deep and aching need for connection, none of it mattered to the people. Who owned him? What mattered was what he could produce. And so Raju was put to work on the streets. Day after day, year after year, he walked the hot, dusty roads of Uttar Pradesh in northern India, used as a begging elephant, a living prop for his owner to collect money from passers-by. Tourists would stop and photograph him. Some would reach out and touch his trunk with wide, curious eyes, completely unaware of the suffering layered beneath that gray, weathered skin. They saw an elephant. They did not see the chains. Let's talk about those chains for a moment, because I need you to truly understand what they meant. These were not light restraints. These were not the kind of thing you could describe with a polite word like tethered. Raju was bound with heavy rusted iron chains that had been wrapped around his legs for so long that in certain places the metal had begun to sink into his skin. The rust mixed with dried blood. The lakes dug deeper with every step, every single movement. Every attempt to shift his weight, to lie down, to simply exist caused pain. He had been standing in the same small patch of earth for so long that the ground beneath him bore the shape of his suffering. He couldn't move more than a few feet in any direction. For an animal whose natural instinct is to roam up to 50 miles a day through open landscape, this was not just cruelty. This was a kind of psychological destruction that is almost impossible for the human mind to fully grasp. Now, think about what 50 years without freedom does to a mind. Elephants are not simple creatures. I need to be very clear about this because everything that comes later in this story depends on you understanding exactly what kind of being Raju is. Elephants have some of the most complex emotional lives of any animal on the planet. They grieve their dead standing over the bones of fallen family members for hours, sometimes days. They recognize themselves in mirrors, something very few species on Earth can do. They form deep, lifelong bonds. They remember. They feel. Scientists who study elephant cognition will tell you that their emotional architecture is not entirely unlike our own, which means that Raju didn't simply endure 50 years of physical pain. He endured 50 years of loneliness. No herd, no family, no one to communicate with in the deep, low-frequency rumbles that elephants use to speak to each other across miles of forest. Just the noise of traffic, the heat of asphalt, roads, the smell of exhaust, and the endless grinding weight of chains that never came off. By the time the right people finally heard about Raju, he was a shadow of what an elephant should be. His body told the whole story if you knew how to read it. He He was severely malnourished, his spine visible beneath his skin in a way that no elephant's spine should ever be seen. His feet, which should have been smooth and well-worn from natural movement across varied terrain, were cracked and infected from years of standing on hard pavement and unnatural surfaces. His ears, which healthy elephants use to fan themselves and regulate their body temperature in India's brutal heat, were torn and scarred. And then there were his eyes. This is the detail that the people who eventually found him could not stop talking about. When they first approached Raju and looked into his eyes, there was almost nothing looking back. Not the bright curiosity you see in a young elephant, not even the guarded wariness of a wild animal, just a deep, heavy, unbearable dullness. These were the eyes of a creature that had stopped hoping. He didn't flinch when people came close. He didn't react with anger or fear. He simply stood there, enormous and broken at the same time, as if he had made peace with the idea that this was simply all there was. This patch of dirt, these chains, this pain, forever. He was fed whatever scraps came his way. Passers-by who felt sorry for him would toss him bits of food. Sometimes fruit, sometimes bread. But there were also reports, later confirmed, that in his desperation, Raju had eaten things that no elephant should ever consume. Plastic bags, garbage, whatever crossed his path when real food didn't come. His owner, by all accounts, saw him only as a source of income. When Raju failed to attract enough donations from strangers on the street, he was punished. When he moved too slowly, he was punished. The bullhook, a sharp metal instrument used by mahouts, left its own marks on his body alongside the chains. Every single day of those 50 years carried some version of this weight. But here is the thing about stories like Raju's, and this is important, so stay with me. They don't end in the darkness. Not always. Because somewhere across the world, in an office filled with photographs of elephants that had been saved and elephants that still needed saving, a phone rang, or an email arrived, or a message was passed through a quiet chain of people. Who cared the kind of chain that, unlike the one around Raju's leg, was built not to restrain but to reach? Someone had seen Raju, someone had taken a photograph, or whispered to a neighbor, or simply couldn't sleep that night with the image of those dull, defeated eyes burned into their mind. And that someone decided that 50 years was enough. On a warm night in July 2014, a convoy of vehicles made its way through the darkness toward a small compound surrounded by trees in Allahabad, India. Inside one of those vehicles was a bolt cutter. Inside another was a veterinarian. And somewhere in the hearts of every single person on that mission was the kind of quiet, fierce determination that only comes when human beings decide, collectively, that they will not look away. Raju stood in the darkness, chained as always, unaware that tonight, after 50 years, something was finally coming to find him. Not another owner. Not another stick, something he hadn't experienced in so long that his body had almost forgotten what it felt like, someone who came to set him free. There is a certain kind of person in this world that most of us will never fully understand, not because they are complicated, not because they are mysterious, but because the thing that drives them, the thing that gets them out of bed before sunrise, that keeps them awake long after midnight, that pulls them towards suffering instead of away from it, is something most of us admire from a distance but rarely possess ourselves. These are the people who run toward the pain. And in the summer of 2014, a group of exactly these kinds of people were about to walk into the darkest chapter of one elephant's life and rewrite the ending entirely. Let me take you back a few weeks before that night in July. Somewhere in Allahabad, India, a message was moving quietly through a network of animal welfare workers, concerned locals, and wildlife observers. It wasn't a formal report. It wasn't a government filing. It was the kind of message that travels the way all urgent, desperate truths travel person to person. Through whispered conversations and photographs passed across phone screens with trembling hands. There is an elephant. He is in very bad condition. Someone needs to help him. That message eventually reached the offices of an organization called Wildlife SOS. If you don't know who Wildlife SOS is, let me tell you, because their story is just as important as Raju's, and in many ways, inseparable from it. Wildlife SOS was founded in 1995 by Kartick Satyanarayan and Jita Seshamani, two Indians who looked at the suffering happening in their own country and refused to pretend it wasn't there. What started as a small grassroots effort to rescue dancing bears, animals that had been captured, had their teeth pulled out, and were forced to perform on street corners for coins, slowly grew into one of India's most respected and fearless wildlife rescue organizations. By 2014, they had saved hundreds of animals. Bears, leopards, elephants, creatures discarded by the world and reclaimed by people who believed that every life deserved a second chapter. But even for a team that had seen genuine horrors, animals broken in ways that would make your stomach turn, the message about Raju stopped people cold. Because 50 years is not a number you hear very often. Even in the world of captive animal rescue, where suffering is unfortunately routine, 50 years of chains on a single animal is the kind of detail that lands in your chest like a stone. Kartick Satyanarayan, the co-founder of Wildlife SOS, would later describe the moment he first learned about Raju as one of quiet, burning fury, the kind of anger that doesn't make you shout, the kind that makes you move. Moving, however, was not simple. This is the part of rescue stories that rarely makes it into the short video clips and the heartwarming headlines. Because behind every dramatic moment of freedom, every chain hitting the ground, every animal taking its first free step, there are weeks of painstaking, frustrating, exhausting groundwork that most people never see. First, there was the matter of legality. In India, elephants are classified under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 as a protected species. In theory, this means owning one requires specific permits and documentation. In practice, the enforcement of these protections has historically been inconsistent, tangled in bureaucracy, and vulnerable to corruption. Raju's owner had held on to him for years, possibly with documentation, possibly without, and simply walking in and cutting the chains was not something Wildlife SOS could do without serious legal consequences. So the team began making calls. Government officials were contacted. Wildlife authorities were briefed. Legal frameworks were reviewed. The Uttar Pradesh Forest Department was brought into the conversation. For weeks, negotiations moved forward, sometimes quickly, sometimes agonizingly slowly, while Raju stood in the dirt and the chains stayed on. Every day of that process had a human cost and an elephant cost. Behind the legal maneuvering, the team was also preparing operationally for what they knew would be a complex and potentially dangerous rescue. An elephant that has been chained for 50 years is not simply an elephant in chains. The psychological and physical trauma of that kind of captivity creates unpredictability. Raju had spent his entire life being controlled through pain and fear. He had no reason whatsoever to trust human beings. And an adult male Asian elephant, even a malnourished one, weighs somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 kilograms. When an animal that size panics, people get hurt. The Wildlife SOS team assembled carefully. Veterinarians who specialized in large animal rescue were brought in. Wildlife officers and forest department personnel were confirmed. A truck large and strong enough to transport an elephant was secured. Medical supplies, sedatives for emergency use, food to help coax Raju's cooperation, and enough lighting equipment to illuminate a nighttime operation were all packed and checked again. There were 10 trained officers on the ground that night alongside the Wildlife SOS team. Each one of them had been briefed. Each one of them knew their role, and each one of them carried the weight of what they were about to attempt, because failure in this kind of rescue isn't just a setback. Failure means leaving Raju behind. Failure means the chains stay on. Nobody on that team was willing to live with that. They made the decision to move at midnight. This was not accidental. Midnight was chosen deliberately for several reasons. The heat of the Indian summer day makes any kind of heavy physical and emotional work exponentially more difficult for the humans involved and potentially dangerous for the elephant. The cover of darkness also offered a strategic advantage in managing the situation with the owner, who was expected to resist. And resist he did. When the convoy arrived at the compound and the team made their intentions clear, Raju's owner did not quietly step aside. There were raised voices. There were threats. There were people in that compound, associates of the owner, who physically positioned themselves between the team and the elephant, and for a tense, stretched-out series of moments, it was genuinely unclear how the night would unfold. The Wildlife SOS team held firm. The Forest Department officers held firm. The legal authorization was presented. The documentation was clear. And slowly, the way resistance crumbles, when it meets something immovable, the opposition began to give way. This, too, is something that rarely makes it into the short clips. The ugliness before the beauty. The confrontation before the compassion. The moments where everything could have gone wrong, and the only thing standing between Raju and another night in chains were people who simply would not leave. And then, for the first time since the team had arrived, someone aimed a flashlight directly at Raju. Several members of the Wildlife SOS team have spoken publicly about this moment, the moment they actually saw him for the first time in person, with their own eyes, rather than through the pixelated screen of a forwarded photograph. One team member described it this way, and I want you to hear this slowly. He was standing in his own dried blood. The chains had worn his ankles to raw, open wounds. In the weak beam of the flashlight, the rust of the iron and the rust-colored stain of old blood were nearly indistinguishable. His body was thin in the way that speaks not of a single missed meal, but of years of inadequate nourishment. His skin, which should have been a smooth, healthy gray, was marked with old scars, patches of raw skin, and the unmistakable evidence of a bullhook used repeatedly over many years. And yet, and this is what struck the team most deeply, he was perfectly still. Not calm, not peaceful. There is a difference between an animal that is calm and an animal that has simply stopped expecting anything to change. Raju stood without fighting, without reacting, not because he was at peace, but because peace was a concept his life had never allowed him access to. He had simply endured for so long that enduring had become the only language he knew. Several people on that rescue team cried when they saw him, quietly, privately, turning their faces away in the darkness. These were professionals. These were people who had done this before, who had seen injured animals and suffering creatures in numbers most of us cannot imagine. But Raju broke through every professional wall every single one of them had built. Now the real work was about to begin. The bolt cutters were retrieved from the vehicle. The veterinarian moved closer, speaking in low, gentle tones, watching Raju's body language. For any sign of panic, the forest officers positioned themselves carefully, not to restrain, but to protect both the animal and the team. One of the Wildlife SOS team members knelt down in the dirt beside Raju's enormous legs. Knelt down right there, in the blood and the dust and the darkness of midnight, and brought the bolt cutters to the first link of the chain. There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough for everyone present to understand the weight of what was happening. Long enough to feel the 50 years compressed into a single breath, a single moment of held stillness before everything changed. Long enough for Raju, who had no way of understanding what was about to happen, who had no framework for freedom, who had spent half a century learning to expect only pain from human hands, to simply stand there, trusting nothing, hoping for nothing. Not yet. The bolt cutters pressed against the iron. The team held its breath, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, the rest of the world went on, completely unaware that in a dusty compound in Allahabad, India, a man was kneeling in the dirt beside a broken elephant and about to do something extraordinary. He was about to give 50 years back, not all of it. You cannot give back 50 years. You cannot return what was stolen. You cannot undo the mornings without grass, or the nights without family, or the endless grinding weight of iron on living skin. But you can cut the chain, and sometimes, cutting the chain is everything. There are moments in life that exist outside of ordinary time. You know the ones. Moments that don't move the way regular minutes move, where everything slows down, sharpens, becomes unbearably vivid and clear, where the air itself seems to hold still, as if the world is leaning in, as if even the darkness is paying attention. This was one of those moments. Midnight in Allahabad, India. July 4th, 2014. The compound was lit by a single portable lantern casting pail. Unsteady light across the dirt ground, the scattered branches, the rusted iron links of a chain that had been on an elephant's legs for longer than most of the people present had been alive. Shadows moved at the edges of the tree line. The summer air was thick and warm and completely still, and in the center of all of it, enormous, motionless, breathing slowly, stood Raju. The man with the bolt cutters was on his knees in the dirt. Let that image sit with you for a moment, because I want you to feel the full weight of it. A man, a trained wildlife officer, someone who had prepared for this night, who had steeled himself professionally for what needed to be done, was kneeling on the ground beside the legs of a 5,000-kilogram elephant, kneeling in dust mixed with dried blood, kneeling in the shadow of 50 years of suffering, and he was trembling slightly, not from fear of the elephant, not from physical weakness. He was trembling because he understood, in a way that went beyond training and beyond professional detachment, exactly what this moment meant. He understood that the chain he was about to cut had been there since before most of the trees surrounding this compound had grown to their current height. He understood that the animal standing above him had never, not once in 5 decades, felt what he was about to feel. He positioned the bolt cutters around the first link. He pressed down. The sound of that first chain breaking was described by those present as something they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. It wasn't dramatic in the way you might imagine. There was no thunderous crash, no cinematic explosion of metal flying through the air. It was a sharp, clean, decisive crack, the sound of iron surrendering, followed immediately by the heavy, dull thud of the chain falling against the dirt. And then silence. The team froze. Every single person in that compound stopped moving at the exact same moment, every eye locked on Raju, watching, waiting, barely breathing, because this was the variable nobody could fully predict. This was the moment that all the careful planning, all the legal preparation, all the veterinary expertise and professional training in the world could not fully account for. An elephant that has known nothing but chains and pain and fear for 50 years, an elephant whose entire understanding of human beings has been built from cruelty, does not necessarily respond to freedom the way we imagine. He might panic, he might charge, he might, in his confusion and his trauma, become dangerous in ways that would hurt people and ultimately hurt himself. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. They watched Raju, and Raju slowly, almost imperceptibly shifted his weight, just slightly. Just enough to feel the absence of the tension that had been pulling at that leg for longer than memory. His massive head lowered a fraction of an inch. His ears, which had been held still against his head, moved just barely. Outward, he didn't understand what had happened. How could he? Freedom is not a concept you can understand in an instant when you've never had it. It's not something that arrives fully formed, like a light switching on. Freedom, for an animal like Raju, was going to be a slow and fragile and deeply confusing thing. But something had changed, something was different. And some ancient buried part of him, some part that lived beneath the 50 years of conditioning and pain and learned. Helplessness felt it. The second chain was next. The team worked steadily, deliberately, speaking to each other in low voices, moving with the careful choreography of people who understand that speed can be the enemy of safety. The veterinarian stayed close, watching Raju's vital signs, watching his breathing, watching the subtle language of his enormous body for any sign that the situation was shifting in a dangerous direction. One by one, the chains came off. Each one fell with that same sharp crack and dull thud. Each one hit the ground and lay there ugly and rusted and obscene, like discarded evidence of a crime. Because that is exactly what they were. And with each chain that fell, something began to happen to Raju that nobody on that rescue team was fully prepared for. He began to cry. I need to be careful here, because I want to give you the truth of this moment, rather than a romanticized version of it. So let me be precise. Elephants do not cry the way humans cry. They do not sob. They do not have the same tear-producing emotional response connected to grief that we associate with crying in people. What they do have are tear ducts, functional ones, and when an elephant is under extreme physical stress, extreme pain, or extreme emotional overwhelm, Those tear ducts produce moisture. What the Wildlife SOS team witnessed that night was tears streaming down Raju's face. Steady, visible, unmistakable tears running down the weathered gray skin of his cheeks as chain after chain was removed from his legs. The veterinarian on the team confirmed it. The photographers who were present documented it. Multiple eyewitnesses described it independently and consistently. Raju was weeping. Whether those tears were purely physiological, the result of a body overwhelmed by a sudden shift after decades of unbroken stress, or whether they carried something deeper, something that lives in the emotional architecture of a creature as complex and feeling as an elephant, is a question science cannot fully answer. But I will tell you what the people in that compound believed in that moment. They believed he knew. They believed that somewhere in the deep, extraordinary intelligence of that battered mind, Raju understood that something was ending, that the long, crushing, unbearable weight of 50 years was lifting, link by link, chain by chain, in the hands of people who had come not to take but to give back. And the team fell apart. There is no other way to say it. These trained, prepared, professional people, wildlife officers and veterinarians and rescue workers who had built walls around their hearts out of the sheer necessity of doing this kind of work, stood in the dirt at midnight and wept alongside the elephant. One team member later said, "I have been doing this work for many years. I have seen terrible things, but I have never in my life felt a moment the way I felt that one." Another described simply being unable to speak for. Several minutes after the last chain fell, these are not weak people. These are not people who cry easily. These are people forged by years of confronting suffering and continuing anyway. And Raju broke every single one of them wide open. The last chain came off. And now, for the first time in 50 years, Raju's legs were free. He stood completely still for a long moment. The team stood equally still, watching, hearts suspended somewhere between terror and awe. The lantern light flickered slightly in a passing breeze. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, a night bird called once and went silent. Raju lifted one foot, placed it down, lifted another. His first steps without chains were not triumphant. They were not the powerful, ground-shaking strides of an elephant reclaiming his wild spirit. They were slow and confused and heartbreakingly tentative, the steps of an animal that has been so long attached to the earth by iron that his body wasn't entirely sure what to do. With the absence of that weight, his legs moved awkwardly, recalibrating, relearning the simple physics of walking without resistance. He took 3 steps, then 4. Then he stopped again and stood very still. The team exhaled. Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. There was an unspoken understanding among everyone present that this was not a moment for celebration, not yet. This was a moment for silence and reverence, and the quiet acknowledgement that what they were witnessing was something rare and sacred. A living thing, taking its first free steps after half a century in chains. The owner made one final attempt. As Raju began to move, as it became physically undeniable and visually real that the elephant was no longer restrained. And the Wildlife SOS team was not leaving without him. There was a last surge of resistance from the corner of the compound. Raised voices again. A step forward from one of the owner's associates. A moment where the tension spiked sharply and hands moved instinctively toward phones and radios. The forest department officers stepped forward calmly and with complete authority. It was over in minutes. The legal authorization was final. The chain was cut. The elephant was already moving. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the right thing and the legal thing are exactly the same thing. And when they are, there is nothing left to argue. The owner stepped back. Raju kept walking. Getting him onto the rescue truck was its own delicate operation. A large, specially prepared transport vehicle had been backed as close to the compound as possible. The team used sugarcane and fresh fruit things. Raju had likely not been offered in generous quantities in a very long time to guide him forward. The veterinarian walked alongside him, speaking in low, calm tones, creating with voice and body language the beginnings of something that would take months to fully build. Trust. Raju was cautious. He stopped several times. He swung his head slowly from side to side, reading the air, reading the people around him with the sophisticated sensory intelligence of an animal built for survival. There were moments where he hesitated so long that the team quietly held their breath again, but he kept moving forward. And eventually, slowly, carefully, one enormous step at a time, he walked up the ramp and into the vehicle that would carry him away from this compound, away from this patch of blood-stained dirt, away from the life that had been imposed on him before he had any say in the matter. The doors closed behind him. And then one of the Wildlife SOS team members did something that said more than any speech or press release or carefully worded statement ever could. He walked back to the center of the compound, back to the place where Raju had stood, that small, worn patch of earth that bore the shape of decades of suffering. He stood there for a moment, alone, looking down at the chains lying in the dirt. Rusted iron, heavy and ugly and still, just chains now, just metal. Without an animal to bind, they were nothing, powerless, purposeless, already beginning to belong to the past. He left them there on the ground and walked back to the truck. As the convoy pulled away into the Indian night, the compound behind them went dark and quiet. The trees stood motionless. The lantern was packed away. The voices faded, and the chains lay in the dirt, in the darkness, exactly where they had fallen. 50 years. Over. Raju was going home to a home he had never seen, built by people he had only just met, in a world that had only just decided he deserved to exist freely within it. He didn't know any of that yet. He was simply in a truck, in the dark, feeling the unfamiliar absence of iron against his skin, and perhaps, just perhaps, something that felt, for the first time in 50 years, like the faint and fragile beginning of relief. There is something nobody tells you about freedom. Not the freedom that comes after a long weekend, or the freedom you feel driving with the windows down on an open road, or even the freedom of finishing something difficult and finally being able to breathe again. I'm talking about a different kind of freedom entirely. The kind that comes after suffering so deep and so long that your entire body has reorganized itself around the pain. That kind of freedom, the real, radical, cellular kind, doesn't feel like joy at first. It feels like confusion. It feels like standing in the middle of something vast and open and incomprehensible, with no map and no language and no framework for understanding what has just been handed to you. Because your whole life, every instinct you developed, every behavior you learned, every way you adapted to survive, all of it was built for the chains. And now, the chains are gone, and you don't know yet what you are without them. This is where Raju was. The journey from Allahabad to the Elephant Conservation and Care Center in Mathura took several hours through the Indian night. Raju rode in darkness inside the transport vehicle, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a world he had never truly been allowed to explore. The rumble of the engine beneath him, the rush of night air through the ventilation, the occasional voice of a team member checking on him, speaking softly through the partition, offering the beginning of something new and terrifying and necessary. Human kindness. At every stop along the route, the Wildlife SOS team checked on him. Water was offered, small amounts of food, and each time the veterinarian leaned close and spoke, not because Raju could understand the words, but because tone travels further than language, and somewhere beneath 50 years of fear, an elephant's ancient intelligence can still distinguish between a voice that means harm and a voice that means something else entirely. He arrived at the sanctuary in the early hours of the morning, just as the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. The Elephant Conservation and Care Center in Mathura is not a zoo. It is not a performance venue. It is not a place where elephants are dressed in paint and paraded before tourists. It is, in the most genuine sense of the word, a sanctuary, a carefully maintained space designed around the physical and psychological needs of elephants that have been rescued from abuse, captivity, and neglect. Green, open, quiet. The kind of place that, if Raju had been born into a different life, might have felt familiar, might have triggered something ancient in his memory. A whisper of what forests feel like, a suggestion of what space is supposed to mean. The truck reversed slowly to the release area. The doors were opened, and for a long, suspended moment, Raju didn't move. He stood at the edge of the truck's opening and simply looked. The sanctuary stretched out before him in the gray pre-dawn light, open ground, trees in the distance, the smell of earth and grass. and damp morning air replacing the exhaust and dust and dried blood that had defined his world for 5 decades. The team stood back, giving him space, giving him time, resisting every human impulse to rush or guide or intervene. This moment belonged entirely to him. It took several minutes. Raju rode in darkness inside the transport vehicle, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a world he had never truly been allowed to explore. The rumble of the engine beneath him, the rush of night air through the ventilation, the occasional voice of a team member checking on him, speaking softly through the partition, offering the beginning of something new and terrifying and necessary. Human kindness. At every stop along the route, the Wildlife SOS team checked on him. Water was offered. Small amounts of food, and each time the veterinarian leaned close and spoke, not because Raju could understand the words, but because tone travels further than language, and somewhere beneath 50 years of fear, an elephant's ancient intelligence can still distinguish between a voice that means harm and a voice that means something else entirely. He arrived at the sanctuary in the early hours of the morning, just as the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. The Elephant Conservation and Care Center in Mathura is not a zoo. It is not a performance venue. It is not a place where elephants are dressed in paint and paraded before tourists. It is, in the most genuine sense of the word, a sanctuary, a carefully maintained space designed around the physical and psychological needs of elephants that have been rescued from abuse, captivity, and neglect. Green, open, quiet. The kind of place that, if Raju had been born into a different life, might have felt familiar, might have triggered something ancient in his memory, a whisper of what forests feel like, a suggestion of what space is supposed to mean. The truck reversed slowly to the release area. The doors were opened, and for a long suspended moment, Raju didn't move. He stood at the edge of the truck's opening and simply looked. The sanctuary stretched out before him in the gray pre-dawn light open ground, trees in the distance, the smell of earth and grass and damp morning air replacing the exhaust and dust, and dried blood that had defined his world for 5 decades. The team stood back, giving him space, giving him time, resisting every human impulse to rush or guide or intervene. This moment belonged entirely to him. It took several minutes. Then one enormous foot appeared at the edge of the ramp, then another. Slowly, with the same heartbreaking tentativeness of his very first steps without chains, Raju descended from the truck and set all 4 feet on the ground of his new home. He froze. Immediately, his feet were on grass. Real, living, soft grass, the kind that gives slightly underweight, the kind that is cool at its roots even in the Indian summer, the kind that is nothing like the hard-packed dirt and hot asphalt that had been beneath him for most of his remembered life. He stood completely motionless for nearly a full minute, and every person watching held their breath, because what was happening in that minute was not nothing. What was happening was that 50 years of sensory deprivation was meeting something it didn't have a category for. His body was trying to remember something it had only known as a calf. The first hours were defined by a word the rehabilitation team used repeatedly in their notes from that morning. Hesitation. Raju did not rush forward into his new world. He did not explore with the energetic curiosity you might expect from an animal finally given space after a lifetime of confinement. He moved in small, careful increments, a few steps. Forward, then a long pause. A slow turn of the head. A deep inhalation through that extraordinary trunk, reading the air for information, for threat assessment. For the answer to the question his entire nervous system was screaming. Is this safe? Because here is the truth about trauma that even the most compassionate rescue story must acknowledge. You cannot undo 50 years in a single night. You cannot cut chains off a body and expect the mind to immediately follow. The body heals faster than the psyche. The wounds close before the fear does. Raju had spent half a century learning that humans brought pain, that movement brought punishment, that any change in routine was a precursor to something worse. These were not beliefs he had chosen. They were survival strategies burned into his nervous system by decades of repetition. Unlearning them was going to take time. The rehabilitation team understood this completely, and their approach reflected it. Nobody rushed him. Nobody pushed. Caretakers assigned to Raju in those first days were chosen carefully patient people, experienced with traumatized elephants, people who understood that the most powerful thing they could offer was not action, but presence. They moved slowly around him. They spoke in low, even tones. They made themselves predictable, arriving at the same times, following the same gentle routines, because predictability, for an animal whose life had been defined by chaos and unpredictability, is its own form of safety. Food was introduced thoughtfully and generously. Fresh fruit arrived: watermelon, bananas, sugarcane in quantities that Raju had never in his captive life been offered freely. The first time a caretaker placed a pile of sugarcane before him, Raju approached it cautiously, as if expecting it to be withdrawn, as if abundance was a trick. He reached out with his trunk, touched the food tentatively, pulled back once, then reached again. And then he ate, slowly at first, then with growing conviction. Then, and this is one of those small moments that the team would remember as deeply significant, with something that looked unmistakably like relief. The mechanical urgency of an animal that has learned not to trust that the next meal is coming. He was fed. He was watered. He was not punished. And every uneventful, gentle, nourishing hour that passed was a single quiet brick in the foundation of something that had never existed in Raju's life before: trust. The medical examination that followed in those first days revealed the full documented horror of what 50 years of captivity had done to his body. The veterinary team worked carefully and thoroughly, and their findings painted a picture that went far beyond what the eye could see on that first night. The wounds on his legs where the chains had bitten deepest and longest were infected in multiple places, some of them alarmingly so, with tissue damage that would require weeks of daily treatment. His feet were in serious condition, cracked and overgrown in ways that indicated years without the natural wear of proper movement across varied terrain. His nutritional state was severe. Blood work confirmed what his visible thinness had suggested: years of inadequate feeding had depleted his body in ways that would take careful, sustained nutritional support to begin reversing. His weight was dangerously below what a healthy adult male elephant of his age and size should carry. And then there was what the vets described carefully as the psychological presentation. Raju displayed several behaviors consistent with what animal behaviorists recognize as the elephant equivalent of post-traumatic stress: repetitive swaying, hypervigilance, a constant exhausting state of alertness that never fully switched off, flinching at sudden sounds or movements, and that deep, consuming reluctance to trust, to engage, to allow any human being truly close. His body had survived 50 years. His mind was going to need longer. But here is what the team also documented, what they noted with quiet, careful hope in those early daily reports: progress. Small, fragile, extraordinary progress. On the third day, Raju walked to the far end of his enclosure and stood under a tree. Just stood there, in the shade, alone, with no chain pulling him back. The caretaker on duty sat at a distance and watched him for 40 minutes, and later wrote in the log, simply, "He stayed under the tree for a long time. He seemed to be resting." An elephant standing under a tree, resting freely in the shade. It sounds like nothing. It was everything. On the fifth day, he was introduced carefully to a mud bath area. Mud bathing is essential to elephant health. It regulates temperature, protects skin from insects and sun damage, and carries a deep behavioral significance for elephants as a social and comfort activity. When Raju first encountered the mud, he stopped and stared at it for a long time. Then, with what the watching caretaker could only describe as slow, deliberate, almost disbelieving intention, he walked into it. The team watching from a respectful distance did not cheer. They did not make a sound. They simply watched an elephant experience mud for what may have been the first time in 50 years, and let the moment be exactly as big as it was. And then came the moment that changed everything for the people caring for him. On the 7th day of his time at the sanctuary, one of his caretakers was sitting quietly near Raju during a routine feeding, speaking softly as he always did, close enough to be a presence but far enough to not be a pressure. He was not reaching for Raju. He was not asking anything of him. He was simply there, and Raju slowly, carefully, with the devastating deliberateness of an animal making a choice that goes against everything its experience has taught it, extended his trunk, reached it across the space between them, and gently, barely, touched the caretaker's hand. The caretaker didn't move, didn't speak. Tears ran quietly down his face as he sat completely still, allowing the touch, understanding in every cell of his body what it had cost this animal to offer it. Later, he would tell the Wildlife SOS team simply, "That was the moment I knew he was going to be okay." 7 days. 7 small, sacred, irreplaceable days. Raju had not been healed. He would not be healed for a long time, not physically, not psychologically. The road ahead was long and uncertain and filled with setbacks that the team was already preparing themselves for. But something had cracked open in those 7 days. Something that 50 years of chains had compressed down to almost nothing, buried so deep beneath fear and pain and learned helplessness that it was barely a flicker. Hope, not the grand, dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet kind, the kind that shows up as an elephant touching a human hand with his trunk and choosing against every lesson his life has taught him to try. The world, meanwhile, was about to find out that Raju existed, and nothing would be the same after that. End of Section 4. Transition to Section 5. Word count. Approximately 1,800 words, you said. Write script for Section 5 in storytelling style. Write script for Section 5 in storytelling style. Write the script in equal number of words as you suggested in your outlines. 4:59 a.m. Claude responded. Section 5. The viral moment, how the world reacted. Calibrated narrative scope and word count requirements. Calibrated narrative scope and word count requirements. Section 5. The viral moment, how the world reacted. Storytelling script, 1,400 words. There is a particular kind of story that the internet was made for. Not the political arguments. Not the outrage cycles that burn hot for 48 hours and then vanish like they never existed. Not the celebrity drama or the manufactured controversy or the endless, exhausting noise of 10,000 opinions colliding at once. I mean the other kind, the kind that cuts straight through all of it, through the cynicism and the scrolling and the carefully constructed emotional armor that most of us have built around ourselves just to survive the daily avalanche of information. The kind of story that finds the part of you that is still soft, still open, still capable of being genuinely, completely, and unexpectedly moved. Raju's story was exactly that kind. And when Wildlife SOS released it to the world stopped scrolling. It began, as most things do now, quietly. A photograph. A few photographs actually released by Wildlife SOS alongside a written account of the rescue on their official channels in the days following July 4th, 2014. The images showed what words alone could not fully convey. Raju in chains, the wounds on his legs, the rusted iron links lying in the dirt after being cut, the team kneeling beside him in the darkness, and most powerfully negative, most devastatingly, the close-up image of Raju's face, with tears visibly streaming down his weathered gray cheeks in the lamplight. That photograph, that single extraordinary, heartbreaking photograph. It moved across the internet with the speed and force of something that has been waiting to exist, shared and reshared, posted and reposted, traveling from one screen to the next in a chain of human beings who looked at it and felt something shift quietly inside their chest. By the following morning, it had reached millions of people. The international media followed swiftly and completely. The BBC ran the story. The Daily Mail ran it. News outlets across the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, Europe, and Asia picked it up and amplified it to audiences that dwarfed anything Wildlife SOS could have reached on their own. Television news segments were produced. Radio programs discussed it. Online publications ran long, detailed pieces about Raju's 50 years of captivity, the rescue mission, and the tears that had stopped an entire team of professionals in their tracks at midnight in Allahabad. Within 72 hours of the initial release, Raju's story had circled the globe, and the response was unlike almost anything the organization had ever witnessed. People wept, openly, publicly, unashamedly in the comment sections of news articles, in the replies to social media posts, in emails sent directly to Wildlife SOS from strangers in countries the PI organization had never operated in. Grown adults writing things like, "I haven't cried like this in years, and I don't know why this hit me so hard, but I cannot stop." There is something worth understanding here, because it speaks to something real and important about human beings. Raju's story broke through the emotional defenses of millions of people, not because it was unusual for an animal to suffer tragically. It is not, but because of the specific detail of those tears. Because of the undeniable, documented, scientifically observed fact that when the chains came off, this elephant cried. And something about that detail, that small, profound, impossible to dismiss detail, collapsed the distance between species. It said, he felt it. It said, he knew. And if he knew, if this animal, after 50 years of darkness, understood in some deep and unreachable part of himself that something was changing, then his suffering had not been abstract. It had not been the suffering of something that simply endured without awareness. It had been experienced, felt, carried. That realization landed in people's chests like a stone dropped from a great height, and they responded with everything they had. Donations began pouring into Wildlife SOS from around the world. Small amounts from individuals who had never donated to an animal welfare organization before. Larger amounts from people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of organization to find them. Wildlife SOS, which operated on the kind of tight, dedicated budget that most nonprofit rescue organizations survive on, suddenly found itself with the resources to do things it had only been able to plan for previously. New enclosures, new medical equipment, additional staff for the sanctuary, enhanced capacity to respond to future rescue calls that would otherwise have gone unanswered. Raju's suffering, in a strange and bittersweet twist, became the fuel that would protect other animals from suffering the same fate. His story didn't just change his life. It changed the lives of animals that hadn't even been found yet. But alongside the outpouring of love and generosity, Raju's story also cracked open a much harder conversation, one that was necessary, one that the international attention made impossible to avoid, because Raju was not alone. At the time of his rescue, Wildlife SOS estimated that there were hundreds of captive elephants across India living in conditions ranging from inadequate to actively abusive. Elephants used for religious ceremonies and temple processions. Elephants used in tourism, giving rides, performing tricks, standing chained in hotel courtyards for the entertainment of guests who had no idea what the animal's life looked like when the tourists went back to their rooms. Elephant captivity is a deeply complex issue in India, woven into centuries of cultural tradition in ways that do not lend themselves to simple solutions or comfortable narratives. There are Mahouts elephant caretakers for whom the relationship with their animal genuinely resembles something like family, and whose knowledge of elephant behavior is deep and generationally inherited. But there is also systematic, widespread, largely unregulated suffering, and Raju's story forced the world to look at both simultaneously: the tradition and the trauma, the culture and the cruelty, without the luxury of looking away. Animal welfare organizations intensified their advocacy. Journalists wrote investigations into the captive elephant industry across Southeast Asia. Lawmakers in India faced renewed pressure to strengthen enforcement of existing wildlife protection legislation. The conversation that Raju's photograph had started in comment sections and living rooms began, slowly and imperfectly, to find its way into places where policy is made. None of it was fast enough. None of it was complete, but it moved because of him. There were critics, too, and fairness demands that we acknowledge them. Some voices questioned the framing of the story, arguing that Western media coverage of animal suffering in developing nations often carries a complicated undercurrent of judgment that ignores the economic realities that drive practices like elephant captivity in the first place. That a man who uses an elephant to beg on the street may himself be desperately poor, without options, operating within a system that failed him long before it failed the elephant. These are not comfortable arguments. They are also not wrong. The full truth of stories like Raju's lives in that discomfort, in the acknowledgement that cruelty rarely exists in a vacuum, that suffering usually has a context, and that real change requires addressing the systems that create these situations rather than simply condemning the individuals most visibly caught within them. Wildlife SOS understood this. Their work was never only about rescuing individual animals. It was about education, community engagement, providing alternative livelihoods for Mahout families, and working with existing cultural structures rather than simply against them. But understanding complexity does not mean excusing what happened to Raju. 50 years is 50 years. The chains were real, the tears were real, and the world's response to both was real. Somewhere in the flood of messages that reached Wildlife SOS in the weeks following the story's release, there was a letter. It came from a child, 8 years old according to the handwriting on the envelope. The letter was short, only a few sentences in the careful, oversized print of a young person still learning how to hold a pen. It had been sent from somewhere in England, addressed simply to the people who saved the elephant. It reached them, and inside, in 8-year-old handwriting that made every adult in the Wildlife SOS office stop what they were doing when it was read aloud, it said, "Thank you for saving Raju. He taught me that kindness is always worth it even when it takes a long time." Let that settle for a moment. Kindness is always worth it even when it takes a long time. 8 years old. From the midnight bolt cutters in a dusty compound in Allahabad to a child's bedroom in England, something had traveled. Something true and necessary and quietly urgent had moved through the noise of the world and landed exactly where it needed to land. Raju had become more than a rescued elephant. He had become a symbol not of what human beings do to animals at our worst, though he was certainly that, but of what we are capable of at our best. Of what becomes possible when someone decides that one life matters, even a life chained in the dark for 50 years, even a life the world had forgotten entirely. Even that life, especially that life. The cameras had told his story. The world had wept and donated and argued and been changed, each in their own measure. But now, as the headlines moved on to the next thing and the social media feeds refreshed and the noise of the world resumed its usual pace, Raju was still in Mathura, still healing, still learning, still discovering, one quiet day at a time, what it meant to be alive without iron around his legs. And the most important part of his story hadn't happened yet. Time does something extraordinary when you finally let it work in your favor. Not the time that grinds, the slow, heavy, chain-weighted time that Raju had known for 50 years, where every hour was identical to the last and tomorrow promised nothing different from today. Not that kind. The other kind. The kind that builds, the kind that layers, quietly and steadily, one gentle day on top of another, until one morning you look up and realize that the creature standing in the golden early light of a Mathura morning bears almost no resemblance to the broken, hollow-eyed animal that stepped off a rescue truck in the dark and stood trembling on grass he didn't know how to trust. That is what time did for Raju, and what it built was nothing short of a miracle, not the dramatic, sudden kind, but the slow, earned, stubbornly beautiful kind that only comes to those who survive long enough to receive it. The physical transformation came first, because bodies, mercifully, are often quicker to heal than minds. In the months following his rescue, under the careful nutritional management of the Wildlife SOS veterinary team, Raju began to gain weight steadily and visibly. The spine that had been disturbingly prominent beneath his skin began to disappear beneath returning muscle and healthy mass. His skin, treated daily with medicated oils and monitored constantly for infection, slowly lost the rawness and scarring around his ankles and began to smooth and strengthen. His feet, those cracked, overgrown, painfully compromised feet that had spent decades on the wrong surfaces, underwent a lengthy and painstaking rehabilitation process. The veterinary team trimmed and treated and monitored them through weeks of careful work, and gradually, as Raju began walking greater distances across the varied, natural terrain of the sanctuary, those feet began to do what elephant feet are designed to do. They carried him freely, By the end of his first year at the sanctuary, the veterinarians who had documented his arrival condition in such grim clinical detail were documenting something entirely different. Weight healthy, wounds healed, mobility significantly improved, nutritional status stable and strengthening. On paper, Raju was becoming, for the first time in half a century, a physically healthy elephant. But it was the other transformation, the quieter, slower, less measurable one, that made the caretakers catch their breath. The repetitive swaying that had marked his early weeks at the sanctuary, that rhythmic, heartbreaking back and forth that animal behaviorists recognize as a coping mechanism developed by elephants in confined, stimulus-deprived environments, began to diminish, slowly at first, then more noticeably. Then, on days when Raju was well-fed and had spent time in the mud and walked a long, unhurried path through the sanctuary grounds, it disappeared entirely. The hypervigilance softened, not all at once, not completely. The deep wariness that 50 years of survival had carved into his nervous system did not simply evaporate, nor should anyone expect it to, but the constant, exhausting, never switching off. Alertness began to give way, in increments, to something that looked increasingly like the ability to simply be without waiting for something terrible to happen next. He started sleeping more deeply. For an animal that had spent decades unable to lie down properly due to the restriction of his chains, the ability to lower his enormous body fully to the ground and sleep, really sleep, heavily and completely, was not a small thing. It was everything. And then there was the friendship. Several months after Raju's arrival, the sanctuary introduced him carefully and gradually to another rescued elephant, a younger male who had his own history of captivity and his own slow road toward healing. The introduction was managed with enormous care by the Wildlife SOS team, who understood that elephant social dynamics are complex and that forcing proximity on two traumatized animals could easily do more harm than good. They need not have worried. The two elephants found each other with a quiet, unhurried naturalness that moved the watching caretakers deeply. There was no drama in it, no sudden moment of recognition or cinematic connection. Just two animals, moving gradually closer over a series of days, reading each other with their extraordinary sensory intelligence. Until one afternoon they were simply standing together in the shade, shoulder to enormous shoulder, as if they had always known each other. Elephants are not meant to be alone. Everything about their biology, their cognition, their emotional architecture is designed for community, for connection, for the deep sustaining presence of others of their kind. Raju had been alone for 50 years, had been starved of companionship as thoroughly as he had been starved of proper food. Watching him stand beside another elephant, unhurried and unafraid, was the moment many of the sanctuary staff would later identify as the one where they truly understood that he was healing, not just surviving, healing. Ask the caretakers who work with Raju daily what he is like now, and their answers carry a warmth that is impossible to manufacture. He loves watermelon emphatically, enthusiastically, in a way that makes the staff laugh every single time. Because there is something irresistibly joyful about an elephant who has discovered a favorite food and greets its arrival with the full, unguarded delight of a creature that has finally learned that good things are allowed to just be good. He loves mud. Long, luxurious, completely committed mud baths that he emerges from caked head to foot and entirely unbothered by the state of himself, the way all elephants should be, the way a creature living fully in its body rather than against it looks. He loves the hour before dusk, when the heat of the day releases its grip and the sanctuary light turns golden and low. The caretakers have noticed that this is the time he walks furthest, moving through the grounds with a slow, unhurried purpose, exploring, taking his time, going exactly where he wants to go with nothing pulling him back. He walks to the water's edge sometimes, in the late afternoon gold, and stands there alone for long minutes, looking at the water, at the light on the water, at something only he can see or feel or remember. Nobody calls him back. Nobody ever will again. Raju's legacy, in the years since his rescue, has grown far beyond one elephant story. His case became a reference point in conversations about captive elephant Welfare legislation across India cited in advocacy documents, discussed in wildlife protection forums, used by organizations as evidence in arguments for stronger enforcement of existing laws and the development of new ones. The international attention his story generated created pressure that, while it has not solved the profound systemic issue of elephant captivity overnight, has contributed to a measurable shift in public awareness and institutional accountability. Wildlife SOS, energized and resourced by the global response to Raju's story, expanded its rescue operations significantly in the years following 2014. More elephants reached, more chains cut, more animals given the chance at the kind of slow, ordinary, beautiful days that Raju now lives. He did not just save himself that night in July. He opened a door. And now I want to bring you back to where we began. Back to the image that started this story, a man on his knees in the dirt, bolt cutters in his hands, a single lantern throwing pale light across the compound, and an elephant standing in the darkness with 50 years of iron around his legs. Hold that image in your mind. Now place beside it the image of Raju today, walking freely in the late afternoon light, standing under a tree, unhurried, unchained, reaching for a piece of watermelon with that extraordinary trunk and eating it with the unself-conscious pleasure of a creature that has finally, fully accepted that it is allowed to experience joy. Distance between those two images is not just the distance of years. It is the distance between what we do to living things when we stop seeing them as living things and what becomes possible when someone decides to see again, when someone refuses to look away. I want to say one more thing before we close, and I want you to really hear it. Raju never got those 50 years back. They are not retrievable. The mornings without grass, the nights without family, the half-century of iron and pain, and learned helplessness, none of that can be undone. The healing that has happened is real and profound and genuinely extraordinary, but it does not cancel what was lost. The people who saved him know this. They carry it. It lives in the work they continue to do every single day for every animal that still needs finding. But here is what else is true. Every morning now, Raju wakes up in a sanctuary built by people who believe his life matters. He is fed with generosity by caretakers who know his preferences and his moods and the particular way he moves when he is comfortable. He walks beside a companion who knows what it means to have survived. He stands under trees in the late afternoon and feels the ground beneath his feet and the air against his skin and the extraordinary, ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being alive without anything pulling him back. He cannot recover the 50 years. But every single day that passes, every watermelon morning, every mud bath afternoon, and quiet dusk walk to the water's edge is a day that belongs entirely and completely to him. And that, after everything, is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. If Raju's story moved you today, I want to ask you to do one thing. Not a big thing, just one small, real thing. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that compassion is still alive in the world. That one person with a bolt cutter and enough determination can change the entire remaining life of another living being. And if you want to go further, if you want to be part of the work that is still happening, for the elephants that haven't been found yet, for the chains that haven't been cut yet, Wildlife SOS is still out there, still working, still running toward the pain, just like they did on a warm July night in 2014, when a man knelt in the dirt and gave 50 years back.